regulations adoption in the first place are gone. We're not talking about inflation in the United States. Now we're worried about deflation. The enacting coalition frayed. The members and the coalitional alignments in Congress that were responsible for enacting this, they're not here anymore. They're gone. In addition, it's not as if everything is worked out perfectly or exactly as was expected. We've had a lot of problems in the airline industry. The industry has yet to earn a normal rate of return on a consistent basis. Carriers still seek economic rents. The carriers are still there. They would like favorable treatment. They would love protections from competition. Planes are crowded. Service stinks, not on Qantas, but. Any of you flown, have any of you flown into O'Hare or Atlanta? You have my sympathies. This is a picture that you, I'm sure, have seen in the American airline sector. We've also had well-organized losers, included creditors, unions, in some cities. It's not the case that nobody is unhappy with this reform. Lots of people are unhappy. Economists will say that on balance, this is still it's efficient, that net, the social benefits exceed the costs, but there are costs. We have a frustrated public, which could be mobilizable. And indeed, problems have been on the agenda. And they've received media amplification. We've had accusations of predatory pricing, delays, concerns about service quality. And yet what is so interesting is that subsequent policy interventions since 1978, of which there have been many, have, for the most part, reinforced the reform path. Carriers have retained the freedom over pricing and routes. And we have not seen, despite ongoing discussion of it, we have not seen significant re-regulation to capture or restore rents or even to minimize the cost of disruption. So what accounts for that? And I argue that the airline deregulation is really a case of the politics of reconfiguration. First of all, the institutional foundations, the governance arrangements of the old interest group system were disassembled. The agency that regulated the airlines, the CIB, was eliminated. You can't find it in Washington anymore. It's not there through a sunset provision. Now, there are still officials in Washington who are concerned with the airlines. And some of them, in fact, would like to re-regulate the airlines. Some of them believe that the system still needs regulation. But they're in the Department of Transportation, where they lack the bureaucratic independence and autonomy to launch their initiatives. They don't have the same power base that they used to. Policymaking today is mediated by much broader and conflicting political forces because of that change in governance arrangements. And importantly, the economic adaptations of social actors to deregulation have made the reform self-reinforcing. Let me just see what's here. Yeah. And as Senator Jack Danforth said, you can't unscramble the egg. We've set in motion forces that aren't going to be reversed. And what do I mean by that in particular? On the investment side, airlines and service providers have made massive complementary investments and human and physical capital predicated on the expectation that they themselves will get to determine where they fly, for the most part. We've seen the construction of fortress hubs and fleets, the creation of yield management systems. All sorts of private actors have built terminals and hangars adapted to the new route structure that emerged post-deregulation. We've seen office parks and suppliers, all sorts of investments that are basically tied to these decisions. It would be impossible to reinstate the old system without massive disruption. It could be done. Congress still has the authority to re-regulate the airlines. You cannot eliminate that authority, but it would be massively disruptive. We've also seen huge changes in coalitional alignments. New discount carriers entered the market. And they, of course, their whole existence is predicated on competition. They wouldn't even exist but for this reform. They were not there, now they are. In addition, legacy carriers, that is to say the carriers that predated deregulation, they've merged or disappeared or struggled to reinvent themselves. Their own identities have changed since deregulation. And this one I think is particularly important, and that is the heterogeneity and fluidity of sector interests has destroyed the cohesion of the old interest group system. It used to be government-faced, constant uniform pressure to maintain the system. Now, it's getting conflicting signals because this carrier would like regulation over here but doesn't want regulation over there, and that one wants just the reverse. So it's not the case that there are no interest groups that are pressuring government to do things, but government has counter pressures. And that lack of constant uniform business pressure makes it easier for government not to do anything, because anything it does, it's going to create enemies. Since each actor faces a different strategic situation, any attempt to re-regulate is going to encounter political resistance from some quarter. Here's just a graph that shows, it's a little hard to see, I know, the incredible changes in the identities of all these air carriers. And on the left, you see what the lineup of American air carriers was pre-deregulation, and you can see how many switches and changes and mergers and reconfigurations there have been in who they are. They are very different companies now than they were. Their DNA has been changed because they have evolved to adapt themselves to this new, more competitive environment. Oops. Indeed, we've even seen shifts in the internal governance of these businesses. It's not only public policy has changed, it's the way these companies organize themselves. After deregulation, airlines' internal governance structures, and I'm talking about things like CEO pay, the concentration of ownership, board size, gravitated toward the governance models of unregulated firms, because now they're unregulated. And so it would now be costly for the firms themselves to go back because they have adapted their own corporate DNA to this new environment. And in some of the other reforms I look at, we've seen similar things. We have a reform called ERISA, which I should remember what it stands for. It's the Employer Retirement Insurance Benefits Act, I think. Do not spend any time studying this act. It is the most convoluted American act. It makes your head hurt to even try to understand what it's about. But what it does in a nutshell was regulate the way in which private corporations give pensions and give health benefits. And as a result of that, throughout the American economy, private firms have had to adapt to this incredibly complex law that is just mind-numbingly complex with convoluted provisions to try to understand how they're going to adapt their own benefit structure to this policy. And they've had to set up human resources offices. They've had to hire tax and pension experts to rewrite and manage their own benefit plans. They've adapted their own governance. And so, and I think this is an important point, rather than powerful actors selecting the reforms they want, deeply embedded reforms select the organizational properties of the actors that survive. There's almost a Darwinian process here. When reforms are really powerful, they determine which actors will continue to exist. A key test of the sustainability of reform, of any reform, is what happens when there's an exogenous shock. When there's a thunderbolt out of the blue in a policy sector. Maybe it's some kind of scandal, maybe it's some kind of disaster, it's something no one foresaw. Can that reform stand up? Or is it going to collapse when that shock comes along? The ultimate exogenous shock for airline deregulation was 9/11. And this was a key test. Are policymakers going to abandon the reform, or is the reform's maintenance going to be taken for granted? Because that's just how we do things. I think there is absolutely no chance that if 9/11 had occurred in 1977, which it could have, that the American government would have deregulated the airlines. If people had captured planes and smashed them into the World Trade Center, there would not have been a push to say, let us scale back the government's role in the sector. But it happened after 20 years of airline deregulation being embedded. And we did see, of course, policy responses in the airline sector. We saw flights grounded. We saw the federal government had to give money to the airline sector because they were bankrupt. They couldn't fly. I mean, flights were grounded for weeks and severely cut back after that. And there was a new board created, the Air Stabilization Board, created to give out $15 billion in loan guarantees and cash assistance. But significantly, this new governance arrangement, the product of 9/11, was given very limited authority, and it was cautioned not to slow the transition of legacy carriers to a competitive market. And indeed, despite the personal intervention of the then Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert from Illinois, near O'Hare, United Airlines' loan application was rejected 3 times. So the most powerful member of the United States Congress had airline interests in his district who wanted special pleading, and this board did not feel compelled to give it. In the end, the ASB ended up not using most of its loan guarantee money. A very different case here of a reform that has not been so embedded. This is what we called freedom to farm. This was an effort in the mid-1990s to scale back the huge amount of agricultural subsidies that the federal government gives. These agricultural subsidies they're highly economically inefficient, they're inequitable. Most of the subsidies, in fact, flow to large agribusinesses that have nothing to do with, John Doe American family farmer there in the prairie in Kansas. These are big companies, and it's scandalous. It's just outrage. I mean, you just find bipartisan agreement among experts that these farm subsidies are just outrageous, and it causes problems for developing countries. It leads to obesity and just all sorts of problems. And so there was a bipartisan reform that was enacted that was supposed to, over time, gradually weed out these subsidies. And of course, we couldn't do it all at once because these farmers are very popular and everybody loves the farmer and the family farmer. But we were going to have a transition scheme. We were going to transition to a market over 5 to 7 years. And you can see the very bottom here, I don't know if I have a pointer. Well, the very bottom line, that was the post-1996 projection of what we were supposed to be spending in the year 2005 and 6 and so on. And you can see in the top what we were actually spending, which